Do you believe in forgiving or forgetting?
I never thought a single sentence could sting so sharply in a room full of people, and yet, as my son Ethan stood there holding his award, looking out at the applauding crowd, the words that came out of his mouth hit me harder than anything I had ever heard. Not even from strangers, not even from people who had disappointed me in the past, because this came from the one person I had poured every ounce of effort, every sleepless night, every penny I had saved into, believing he would one day see how much I had sacrificed for him, believing he would at least acknowledge that without my constant support, he might have been standing there at all, and instead, with this careless grin and a confidence that bordered on arrogance, he said, "You don't deserve any credit," and the room erupted in laughter and applause, as if he had just delivered a clever joke instead of publicly erasing years of everything I had done to get him to this point. I remember standing there, holding my breath for a second, trying to figure out if I had heard him right, if maybe my ears had betrayed me, if perhaps the world was mocking me along with him. But no, I heard every single word clearly. And I could feel the eyes of parents, teachers, and distant relatives flicking from him to me, trying to gauge my reaction, trying to guess if I would erupt in anger, if I would cry, or if I would collapse under the weight of humiliation. And for a moment, I wanted to do all three, because it wasn't just the sentence itself, it was the timing, the audacity, and the fact that he had chosen a moment when everyone was watching to make me feel small, and yet, for some reason, I smiled, a slow, calm smile that hid the storm behind my eyes, because I realized that reacting the way people expected me to would only give him power, and I wasn't about to hand it to him so easily. I could feel my heart racing, not with shame, not with defeat, but with a strange combination of disbelief, hurt, and a very careful kind of satisfaction, because somewhere deep down, I knew that his confidence, the way he assumed he had everything handed to him, was exactly what I needed to see in order to start planning the next steps. And even as the ceremony continued, as people shook hands with him and praised his achievement, I found myself zoning out, replaying the moment over and over, considering what had led to this, how the conversations at dinner, the arguments over grades, the endless encouragement that had often gone unappreciated, had all built up to this exact point where he thought it was acceptable to say that to me, in front of everyone. And yet, even as I felt the heat of embarrassment creeping into my cheeks, I realized I had the advantage, because he had made a public mistake that would shape his understanding of consequences, even if he didn't know it yet. After the applause died down and the crowd started to disperse, I followed him into the hallway where the teachers and students were gathering for photos and congratulations, and I watched him bask in the praise of people who were oblivious to what had just happened. And in that moment, I remembered the long nights I had spent helping him with projects he barely cared about, the times I had rearranged my own life to make sure he had the resources and opportunities other kids took for granted. And I felt a mixture of anger and resolve, because I knew that I couldn't undo the embarrassment, I couldn't take back the words, but I could take control of the consequences. I could create a situation where he would have to confront his attitude and learn that entitlement without gratitude would never serve him in the real world, and I could do it without shouting, without shame, without theatrics, because this had to be smart, precise, and unforgettable. I didn't follow him into the photo session immediately. I lingered just a few steps back, pretending to adjust my purse, pretending to smile at someone I barely knew, while silently mapping out my plan. Thinking about the college fund I had been saving for years, the savings I had managed to protect despite unexpected bills and emergencies, and how much easier it would be for me to turn that resource into a lesson he could not ignore. And I allowed myself a small, almost imperceptible grin, because while the world applauded him for his achievement, I realized that the real test had just begun, and it wasn't about the award or the ceremony, it was about the moment when he would have to face reality and recognize that words without respect, accomplishments without humility, and pride without gratitude would never shield him from the consequences of his own actions, and I had all the cards in my hands to ensure he understood that lesson in a way that he could not misinterpret or forget. And so, I left the ceremony that day with my head held high, a calm smile on my face, and a mind racing with possibilities, because the truth was, while Ethan thought he had embarrassed me in front of everyone, I had already begun shaping a plan that would turn the tables completely, and the satisfaction of knowing that he would soon learn the true weight of his arrogance made every step home, every conversation, and every quiet moment afterward feel charged with anticipation, as if the next chapter of this story had already begun, and I knew that by the time I was done, he would not only remember this day forever, he would remember who really held the power, and it wouldn't be him. After leaving the ceremony, I drove home in silence, not because I was upset in the way people might expect, but because my mind was working overtime, replaying Ethan's words over and over, analyzing the way he had so casually dismissed everything I had done for him, and as I sat in the quiet of my living room, I realized that the hurt I felt was mixed with a very particular kind of clarity. The kind that comes from seeing someone you love and have sacrificed for reveal their true colors in a moment you can never take back, and I knew immediately that I had to respond, not with anger, not with punishment for punishment's sake, but with a calculated lesson that would make him confront the consequences of entitlement and disrespect in a way that would be impossible to ignore, because it was one thing for him to say that to me in front of strangers, but it would be an entirely different experience when those words met reality in a very tangible, unavoidable form. I spent hours that afternoon pacing the living room, thinking about the countless times I had rearranged my life to support him, from the extra tutoring sessions he never asked for, to the part-time jobs I had encouraged him to take so he could build a sense of responsibility he clearly had not yet internalized, to the careful savings I had set aside for his college fund, all of which had been accumulated slowly and deliberately over years, and as I reflected on all of it, I realized that what he lacked was not knowledge, not opportunity, but a recognition that privilege without accountability can leave someone unprepared for life. And I began considering how I could convert the very thing he had taken for granted into a tool for understanding, a mechanism that would force him to confront the fact that success is only meaningful when it is earned, and that words spoken with arrogance and entitlement can come back to challenge a person in ways they never imagined. I thought about the college fund and how long I had protected it, how much I had invested in it, and while I had always intended it to be a safety net, the thought occurred to me that removing it temporarily could be the clearest, most direct way to teach him that life does not reward people simply because they exist, and that recognition, applause, and material support are all conditional on effort, humility, and the ability to appreciate what is given rather than assuming it is owed. And as I considered this, I felt a mixture of anxiety and resolve because I knew that this step, while emotionally intense, had to be done carefully, without malice, and in a way that would make him understand the lesson without breaking his spirit entirely. Because the point was never to humiliate him, it was to awaken him, to make him realize that the world outside of his bubble of privilege would not bend to his demands or tolerate arrogance. I decided to create a note, simple and direct, that would accompany the funds once I redirected them, a note that said nothing inflammatory, nothing cruel, but which would force him to pause, reflect, and take responsibility in a way he had never experienced before, and the words I settled on, "prove yourself," were precise because they captured exactly what he needed to understand, that entitlement without effort is meaningless, and that earning trust, recognition, and resources requires more than just talent or appearance of achievement, and as I wrote the note, I felt a quiet sense of satisfaction, a sense that for the first time in a long while, I was setting boundaries and taking control of a situation that had spiraled far beyond a simple parent-child disagreement. I also reflected on how I would manage the next few days, knowing that he would eventually discover the change, and I planned every detail, from the timing of the discovery to the initial lack of explanation, because I wanted the lesson to land fully, without me having to push it, without me having to lecture or yell, and I knew that if I was patient and consistent, the consequences of his arrogance would become his own responsibility, and he would have to navigate the confusion, frustration, and urgency that would follow, which would force a kind of self-reflection that no argument or conversation I could have would ever produce. And I recognized that this was not just about a single action or a single lesson, but about shaping his understanding of how the world actually functions, how respect and accountability are earned, and how the people who support him are not simply there to be thanked casually, but to be recognized for the care and effort they have invested. By the time evening rolled around, I had confirmed the transfer, placed the note where he would find it, and set the plan in motion with a sense of calm that surprised me, because while part of me had expected to feel guilty or worried, I felt nothing of the sort. Instead, I felt control, clarity, and anticipation, because I knew the moment he discovered the missing funds, the confusion, panic, and frustration would be immediate, and I could watch, almost clinically, as he wrestled with the reality that his entitlement could not shield him, that recognition and applause were empty without humility and respect, and as I prepared for the storm I had intentionally created, I felt a quiet sense of satisfaction in knowing that the lesson would be his own, unavoidable and undeniable, and that this would be a turning point in our relationship. A moment that would either reshape his attitude or leave him fumbling to understand what had happened, and in either case, the next time he spoke to me, it would be with a new awareness that I was not just a provider, but someone who could hold him accountable in a way that mattered. When Ethan finally noticed that the college fund was gone, the first thing I realized was that his reaction would not be polite, measured, or calm, because he had spent so many years assuming that everything I had worked for was simply his by default. And as I watched him pace back and forth in the living room, fumbling with his phone and muttering under his breath about bank accounts, transfers, and parental overreach, I could almost feel the gears in his mind spinning as he tried to reconcile the fact that what he had considered an unshakable safety net had vanished overnight, leaving him entirely responsible for a problem he had never anticipated facing, and in that moment, I understood that this was precisely the impact I had intended, because he needed to feel the weight of entitlement meeting reality in a way that words, lectures, or arguments could never achieve, and I allowed myself a quiet, controlled sense of satisfaction as I sipped my coffee, pretending to read the newspaper while listening to his escalating frustration fill the room. He started blowing up my phone with frantic texts, each one more desperate than the last, alternating between confusion, blame, and indignation, and as I scrolled through the messages without responding immediately, I realized how fascinating it was to watch him process the situation on his own. To see him slowly piece together that the safety net he had taken for granted was not merely inaccessible for a day or two, but had been intentionally redirected to force him into action, and with each frantic text I received, I felt the full weight of the lesson taking shape in real time, because this was not about control or cruelty, it was about showing him that the world did not operate on assumptions, that every resource, every opportunity, and every advantage had value only when it was respected, appreciated, and used responsibly, and that when entitlement replaced gratitude, consequences inevitably followed. The first few messages were accusatory, demanding explanations, questioning my judgment, and insisting that the disappearance of the funds was either a mistake or a technical error, and I let him stew in that confusion, knowing that clarity, when it finally came, would carry a much deeper impact than anything I could say in the moment, because his assumption that I would immediately respond to his panic, that I would simply fix the problem for him, was exactly what needed to be challenged, and as he continued to send message after message, alternating between pleading and veiled threats, I realized that the panic in his words was genuine. The stress of having to face a challenge he had never expected to encounter was real. And the lesson was already unfolding exactly as I had hoped, leaving him to confront the uncomfortable reality that entitlement and arrogance could not shield him from responsibility or consequences, no matter how much applause he had received earlier that day. When he finally called, his voice was strained, urgent, and surprisingly unpolished, full of the kind of frustration that comes only when someone realizes they have overstepped and must now face the results, and as he rattled off a combination of accusations, half-formed questions, and frantic reasoning, I simply listened, calmly and without interruption, because every word he uttered, every pause, every stumble was a window into his understanding of the situation and a step closer to the acknowledgement that his previous behavior had been unacceptable, and I could feel, almost with a tangible sense of satisfaction, that the lesson was hitting him in a way that would not be easily dismissed or ignored. Because he had now entered a state of active reflection, the kind that cannot be imposed, but must be discovered through direct experience, and this was the core of what I had intended from the moment I decided to redirect the college fund. By the time the evening stretched into late hours, his texts and calls had intensified, each one laced with a mix of frustration, disbelief, and an emerging sense of urgency, and I realized that the impact of my actions was now irreversible. Because he was forced to acknowledge the absence of the support he had always assumed, and the note I had left, simple, direct, and completely unembellished with emotion, was already doing exactly what I had hoped, prompting him to pause, think, and confront the uncomfortable truth that achievement and opportunity were not automatic, and that he could not rely on privilege or entitlement to navigate challenges he had never learned to address on his own. And as I observed his reactions unfold, I felt a powerful combination of pride and relief, knowing that the situation had escalated in the precise way I had anticipated, that he was learning a lesson that words alone could never teach, and that the first phase of my plan, carefully conceived and patiently executed, had succeeded in shifting his perspective in a profound and lasting way, leaving him to wrestle with the implications of his own assumptions and paving the way for the next steps that would cement this lesson even further. By the end of the night, I put my phone down and leaned back, allowing myself a moment of quiet satisfaction, because I understood fully that while Ethan was frantic, frustrated, and scrambling to figure out how to regain what he had lost, I had created an opportunity for him to learn accountability, humility, and the real cost of taking things for granted, and even though he had not yet expressed gratitude or understanding, I knew that the shift had begun, and the confrontation with consequences he had never imagined would continue to shape his behavior and thinking long after the panic faded, and in that sense, I felt an enormous sense of accomplishment, knowing that the path to true understanding had finally started. By the time Ethan's frantic calls had subsided into tense, clipped voicemails, I knew that the first shock had fully landed, and as I observed him navigate the panic I had carefully orchestrated, I realized that he was now being forced to confront a reality he had never experienced before, a reality where privileges he had assumed were unshakable suddenly became conditional on his ability to act, to reflect, and to take responsibility in a meaningful way, and while part of me had expected him to lash out in anger, what unfolded was far more revealing, because instead of immediately blaming me or questioning my motives, he began reaching out to the people around him, to his friends, mentors, and even distant family members, trying to understand what had happened, trying to gauge whether this disappearance of funds was temporary, a mistake, or an intentional test, and I listened quietly from the other room, letting the natural consequence of his assumptions unfold, aware that this independent investigation, this scrambling to assess the situation on his own, was exactly what I had wanted him to experience. He began sending long, carefully constructed messages that shifted between pleading for clarification and attempting to negotiate a compromise, and as I read them, I could see the beginnings of his internal struggle as he realized that he could not manipulate the outcome simply by being loud, persistent, or demanding, because the rules had changed, and for the first time in his life, he was forced to operate in a framework where his actions mattered more than his words, and while I had expected resistance, I was surprised by the depth of his frustration and the persistence with which he tried to assert control over a situation that had entirely escaped his grasp, and it became increasingly clear that the note I had left with the transferred funds, simple as it was, had triggered a chain reaction of self-examination, confusion, and the first flickers of accountability, even though he was still too proud to acknowledge it explicitly. Over the course of that evening, his panic evolved into strategy, and I watched him carefully plot, reassess, and make calls that were uncharacteristic of him, because instead of relying on me, he had to rely on his own reasoning, judgment, and determination to solve a problem he had never encountered before. And I realized that this was precisely the point, because until someone is forced to face the immediate consequences of their entitlement, they cannot truly understand the value of what they have been given. And in that realization, I felt a mixture of pride, anticipation, and quiet triumph, knowing that the carefully calibrated shift I had initiated was beginning to work, that the first layers of arrogance and assumption were peeling away, and that for the first time, Ethan was encountering the kind of challenge that demanded genuine effort, humility, and reflection, rather than relying on automatic support. As the night deepened, the tone of his messages shifted from frantic questioning to calculated determination, and I began to see him experimenting with approaches he had never considered before, drafting plans, calculating potential outcomes, and even questioning whether he had underestimated my ability to act decisively. And while part of me felt satisfaction at seeing him scramble, another part of me recognized that this was a pivotal moment for him, because the way he responded now, in the immediate aftermath of realizing that his assumptions no longer applied, would define his behavior in the future, would determine whether he approached life with gratitude and responsibility or reverted to entitlement and expectation. And I felt a quiet, satisfied certainty that the lesson was embedding itself in his consciousness in a way that could not be undone by a simple explanation or apology. I allowed him to struggle, to make mistakes, and to confront dead ends without interference, observing from a distance as he learned, problem-solved, and discovered firsthand the consequences of taking security and support for granted. And I realized that the brilliance of this method was not in retribution but in empowerment, because by removing the safety net temporarily, I had created a scenario where he had no choice but to engage with reality, to work for the solution, to develop resilience and self-awareness that he could never have acquired if I had simply explained why his earlier behavior was unacceptable. And by the time he paused to catch his breath, I knew that the first stage of transformation was underway. As frustration was gradually replaced with a dawning understanding, and the frantic urgency that had defined his initial reaction had begun to morph into focused, intentional action. The kind of action that comes only when someone is finally forced to prove themselves, without relying on anyone else. By the end of the night, he had sent me a single, brief message that simply said, "I am working on it," and while it lacked detail or apology, I recognized in those words the first authentic acknowledgement that he understood the situation, that he could no longer rely on entitlement, and that he had begun to internalize the principle that effort, respect, and accountability were the currency he now had to earn. And as I set the phone down and leaned back, I felt the quiet satisfaction of a plan executed flawlessly, because the storm I had anticipated had arrived. It had challenged him exactly as I intended, and I could see that the lessons of the day were only just beginning to take root, with the next steps destined to push him further into a confrontation with his own assumptions, arrogance, and sense of entitlement. And in that sense, the stage was perfectly set for the final reckoning, when the full extent of his responsibility would become unavoidable and the true measure of his character would finally be tested. By the time Ethan finally sat down at the kitchen table late that evening, phone buzzing nonstop beside him, his face a mixture of exhaustion, disbelief, and grudging determination, I could see that the series of frantic calls, missed opportunities, and dead-end solutions had stripped away the arrogance that had carried him through so many achievements under the assumption that he had an unshakable safety net. And as I watched him carefully open his laptop, calculate budgets, and start mapping out a plan that required more work, creativity, and accountability than he had ever been asked to give in his life, I realized that this was the moment when the lesson I had orchestrated would crystallize into something irreversible. Because he was no longer operating on assumptions, he was no longer relying on inherited privilege, and he was confronting, with everything in his attention, the reality that his success was now contingent on his own actions, judgment, and persistence, and the sense of satisfaction I felt was tempered only by the knowledge that the impact of this confrontation would echo far beyond tonight, shaping his approach to responsibility, entitlement, and respect for the resources and opportunities he had taken for granted. He typed and erased, recalculated and paused, and even when he made mistakes, I could hear the quiet mutters and reassessments that betrayed a mind operating in a way it never had before. And while I could have intervened at any moment to correct or guide him, I sat back and allowed him the space to fail, to struggle, and ultimately to improvise, because this was not a lesson that could be taught with words alone. It was a lesson that required the full weight of consequence, frustration, and problem-solving to resonate. And as I observed him navigating spreadsheets, contacting friends for advice, and evaluating options that he had previously dismissed as beneath him, I felt a growing sense of pride mixed with an almost electric anticipation, knowing that every misstep, every hesitation, and every incremental success was embedding understanding into his decision-making in a way that would never be forgotten. Hours passed, and his frantic energy shifted into focused diligence, and I could see the way he started prioritizing, weighing outcomes, and accepting advice without defensiveness, and in that transformation, I realized that the note I had left, simple, uncompromising, and deliberately minimal, had worked exactly as intended because it forced him to pause and confront the reality that the college fund was no longer a guarantee, that I was no longer a passive provider of comfort or convenience, and that he would need to prove himself through action, judgment, and perseverance. And even though he had started the evening convinced that I had orchestrated the removal of the funds purely as a punitive measure, by now he was beginning to understand the deeper principle at play, that entitlement is fragile, that achievement without accountability is hollow, and that respect and responsibility are earned rather than assumed. By the time he finally looked up from the laptop and hesitated, glancing at me as if searching for reassurance or an acknowledgement, I could see the tension in his posture, the cautious humility in his expression, and the flicker of comprehension that he was finally beginning to grasp, and I leaned forward, allowed myself to smile gently, and said nothing, because the silence carried its own affirmation, a quiet acknowledgement that he had navigated the obstacle, learned the weight of consequence, and begun to earn back what had been temporarily withheld, and in that moment, I realized that this was the culmination of a carefully executed plan that had been months in the making, a sequence of events designed to create disruption, challenge assumptions, and ultimately force growth and understanding in a way that words, lectures, or punishment alone could never achieve. The following morning, the phone finally stopped buzzing, and Ethan approached me with a mixture of nervousness and resolve, holding a list of options he had researched, budgets he had recalculated, and plans he had drafted to replace what had been removed from his college fund, and as he spoke, outlining each step with focus, detail, and determination, I could hear in his voice the unmistakable evidence of transformation. Because he was no longer simply reacting, blaming, or expecting, he was actively taking ownership, strategizing, and demonstrating accountability in a way that made it clear the lesson had landed, and while he had yet to express full gratitude or explicitly admit that he had been in the wrong, his actions spoke louder than any words could, revealing a level of maturity, focus, and respect that had previously been absent, and that would shape his behavior far beyond this single incident. As I finally put the coffee mug down and watched him leave to make the first calls on his plan, I felt an immense sense of satisfaction, not because I had been harsh or punitive, but because I had created a situation in which he could not hide from responsibility, could not manipulate outcomes, and could not escape the consequences of entitlement. And in the quiet after his departure, I realized that this was not just about a college fund, it was about teaching a principle that would resonate throughout his life, a principle that could not be ignored, skipped, or taken lightly, and I allowed myself the rare, quiet joy of knowing that every carefully planned action, every delayed response, and every moment of patience had led to this precise result. He had been forced to confront himself, and in that confrontation, he had begun to grow in a way that would be impossible to reverse, and I knew with absolute certainty that the lesson, the challenge, and the reckoning had succeeded, and the last move in a plan executed with precision and patience had landed exactly as I had intended.